I recently played a few hours of Far Cry 6, and it's largely delightful. Tight action, a gorgeous bunch of locations, and all the attack helicopters I can fly. Seriously, the game is just wonderful to play. I have a gator who's my best friend because he loves to chomp on soldiers that aren't me, and whenever I want, I can create a rock slide to crush cars. I'm sure I'll enjoy playing the full version in October. That said, 3 things came up during my playthrough that have the possibility to ruin the game for me, and possibly others, and I'd like to address them here in the hopes of giving potential players and even the developers a heads up. First off, the political stuff. The game is explicitly not set in Cuba. The developers are very clear about that. The problem is, the setting is so inspired by Cuba that the developers' changes to it have turned the setting into nonsense. In the world of Far Cry 6, the country of Yara had a presumably Marxist revolution against a fascist dictator back in the 60s. The demo didn't have enough plot to explain the middle part of the story, but at some point the fascist dictator's son, Bakersfield PD's Giancarlo Esposito, took over, and the country is now a fascist dictatorship again. This creates a weird hole in the game's world building, because Yara has supposedly been under a severe embargo over the past half-century, which is why the characters are using old technology that's been jerry-rigged extensively. While this makes sense in the game's inspiration, Cuba, there's no reason for Yara to be under an embargo in the world of the game. America loves fascist dictatorships, so the moment Giancarlo took the island over, they would have dropped all embargo so that the country could start trading internationally again, which is the first step in having giant corporations move in and privatize all of the country's resources. Encouraging and supporting the establishment of fascist dictatorships throughout Central and South America has been the United States' most successful foreign policy project of the past 70 years, tied, of course, with the continuing existence of the country of South Korea. Likewise, this makes the scene in which the characters are excited to escape to Miami kind of nonsensical. It makes sense for Cubans to be excited to get to Miami, because both major American political parties are largely supportive of Cuban refugees. Democrats are fine with them because the Democratic Project is generally about trying to improve people's lives, and fleeing a repressive regime to a more open one theoretically means that there's less misery in the world, which is a net positive. Republicans like Cuban refugees because they're reliable Republican voters, which gives the party more political power that they can then use to oppress and brutalize all non-Cuban refugees. So Cubans arriving in Miami, basically a win-win. Yarans would have no comparable role in American culture, because unlike Cubans, who are fleeing one of the world's only nominally communist countries, Americans would see Yarans as non-white people fleeing from fascism, which the American government doesn't look kindly on, because, again, they're the ones who set up all the fascist governments in the first place. I know that Ubisoft desperately wants to remain non-political, but the game's attempts to accomplish that have apparently transformed the world building into a pretzel of nonsense. Of course, that's just based on what I've seen. It's possible that we'll learn later that Giancarlo is specifically hostile to the United States for some reason, and that's why the blockade has continued. But right now, the game's story isn't looking great. The second issue is based on gameplay, which has taken a terrible turn in one specific mechanic. I don't know if you're familiar with Wolfenstein Youngblood, but it's a co-op focused Wolfenstein sequel which could have been a delight to play, were not for A, the games as a service features, which force you to replay missions endlessly with minor variations in order to progress and unlock anything, and more importantly B, the ammo type system, in which different guns fired 2 different bullet types, and each enemy was only weak against one of them, and it was only possible to tell which one if the player looked at a tiny indicator over the enemy's head. This had the function of interfering with the pace of what's supposed to be Wolfenstein's patented speedy improvisational combat. It was such an annoying mechanic that it drove me away from the game before I'd even completed half of it. Games have solved the armored enemies problem years ago. Guns hurt enemies based on the gun's power level, unless those enemies are armored. If they're armored, the player has to use an explosive to expose their weak point and then resume shooting. With minor variations, this is how nearly every game functions, and it's a system that works fine. Wolfenstein Youngblood was rightly reviled for including this terrible system, so it's a bit baffling the developers of Far Cry 6 looked at it and said to themselves, you know what's wrong with this? They needed more different ammo types. On the upside, players can have multiple ammo types for each individual gun in Far Cry 6, allowing them to make their favorite firearm an explosive, armor-piercing, or hollow point weapon. They'll have to make this switch at a workbench though, so a bad loadout can force the player into terrible situations mid-mission. Especially because, unlike in Youngblood, where enemies' health bars warned what kind of ammo is best to use against them, Far Cry 6's enemies have to be scouted in advance to discover their weaknesses. I'm sure once I've spent more time with the game, I'll be able to judge what kind of gun to use based on enemy costuming. But it's still a level of needless complication that hurts the game. This is especially frustrating because it pulls the game away from a basically realistic heightened action shooter and starts shifting it into RPG territory. More than once I fired a sniper rifle bullet into an opponent's face from under 100 yards away, and then had them lose some portion of their health and immediately sound an alarm. If these characters were wearing helmets and I'd been firing with a hollow point bullet, I'd maybe cut the game some slack. But these characters were unarmored, and I was punished for shooting them with an armor-piercing bullet. Here's the thing. Headshots need to kill enemies that don't have helmets on, no matter what the circumstance. Start compromising there, and pretty soon you're making The Division, where I fired a shotgun into a man's face from 3 feet away, and it took just a tiny sliver of his health off, because I was level 3 and he was level 12. While I won't say no one wants that, because people do, in fact, buy Division games, I will say that no one who wants to play a Far Cry game wants that kind of nonsense included. Perhaps most troubling is the other big change I noticed. The game doesn't have an experience system or skill tree to unlock abilities. All character improvement is done by acquiring and equipping gear. By doing so, the game strips out the feeling of accomplishment in character leveling, and normalizes the idea that character improvement comes not from accomplishing things within the game and having the main character grow and change, but instead occurs because new items were received. This is a troubling direction for the game to go in, because it leaves the player ripe for exploitation via microtransactions. Ubisoft got quite a bit of heat for turning their last few Assassin's Creed games into grindy slogs so that they could convince players to buy experience boosters. They'd purposefully destroyed the game's balance in the hopes that they could get people to pay to undo the damage they did. It was a crude, obvious ploy. This new system of character advancement via gear is a much more elegant way into the player's pockets, if that's what Ubisoft is looking to do. While it can seem underhanded and a betrayal to ask players to pay money to pass levels in a game, asking them to pay money for costumes and charms is a well-established practice in the games industry. By tying these costumes and charms directly to the character's abilities, Ubisoft can now force players to pay real money to enable different playstyles. Will they go through with this and further dig away at what makes Far Cry an interesting series? I can't say, but given their history with monetization in games, I also can't be optimistic. So, that's what I'm most concerned about. Join me back here next time for the reason I'm definitely going to be playing Far Cry 6. I've been the Hidden Object Guru, thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons Marissa, Desire, Eduardo, and Joanne for their support. If you'd like to support the channel so I can keep making videos like this one, you can find the Patreon link in the description below. I'll see you back here for the next thing, but until then, au revoir.